Sometimes, the land everyone abandons is hiding the very miracle they'll spend fortunes trying to reclaim. The foreclosure notice trembled lightly in Caleb Turner's weathered hand as the dry Texas wind swept across the cracked parking lot outside First Prairie Bank. At 43, Caleb looked older than his years, his broad shoulders bent beneath seasons of drought, debt, and grief. His once promising cattle ranch outside Amarillo had withered under 3 unforgiving summers, leaving him with little more than unpaid bills, a rusted pickup, and silence heavy enough to break a stronger man. The banker's polished voice still echoed in his ears, offering hollow sympathy while discussing payment deadlines Caleb already knew he could never meet. He climbed into his faded Ford truck, the cracked leather seat sighing beneath him, and stared through the dusty windshield at a world that seemed determined to forget men like him. Then his phone rang. The call came from an attorney in Northern California, informing Caleb that his estranged uncle Walter, a man he hadn't seen in over 20 years, had passed away and left him his entire estate, a 100-acre orchard in the foothills near Sonoma, long since ruined, along with a collapsing farmhouse and 1 elderly horse. Caleb almost laughed at the cruel absurdity. He had no money, no future, and now inheritance had gifted him another dying piece of land. But with foreclosure looming, he had little choice. 3 days later, after driving nearly 1,500 miles through deserts, mountains, and forgotten highways, Caleb arrived at Blackthorn Orchard. The property looked like a ghost of prosperity. Endless rows of dead apple trees twisted from the dry earth like skeletal fingers. The farmhouse sagged under decades of neglect, its once white paint peeled away by wind and rain. The barn leaned slightly, its roof patched with rusted tin. And standing alone beneath the shadow of a dying oak was the horse. Dusty. A faded mustang with a graying coat, scarred flanks, and tired eyes that seemed impossibly older than the land itself. He was thin, but not broken. Worn, but watchful. Caleb approached cautiously, boots crunching over brittle grass, expecting indifference. Instead, Dusty lifted his head and stared directly into him, as though measuring the weight of the man now standing on ruined soil. There was something unsettling in that gaze, not fear, not weakness, but recognition. Caleb exhaled slowly, reaching out a rough hand. Dusty did not flinch. In the distance, neighboring vineyard owners watched from polished trucks, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the bankrupt rancher inheriting dead land and an old horse fit for pasture retirement. One wealthy investor even stopped by that evening, offering Caleb cash on the spot for the property, calling it a mercy. Caleb declined, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps desperation. Or perhaps it was the strange way Dusty kept glancing toward the farthest corner of the dead orchard, where the earth seemed untouched by time. As the sun bled gold across the ruined rows, Dusty suddenly pawed at the ground with surprising force, once, twice, then again, stirring clouds of dry soil into the fading light. Caleb frowned, watching the old horse's restless urgency. For the first time in years, amid ruin, debt, and dying trees, something deep in Caleb's chest stirred, not hope exactly, but curiosity. And sometimes, curiosity is where miracles first begin. Morning arrived over Blackthorn Orchard with a cold silver mist rolling between the dead rows of apple trees, softening the ruin just enough to make it look almost alive again. Caleb Turner stepped onto the sagging porch with a chipped coffee mug in hand, his boots creaking against weathered wood as he surveyed the inheritance that had become both burden and mystery. The orchard stretched for what felt like forever, 100 acres of forgotten promise, each twisted tree a monument to seasons of neglect. He had spent the night inside Uncle Walter's decaying farmhouse, where dust-coated furniture and faded family photographs whispered of a man who had once believed this land could thrive. Yet everywhere Caleb looked, he saw only expenses. Broken irrigation lines. Rotting fences. A collapsing barn. Property taxes he could barely imagine paying. By any rational measure, selling was his only chance. But Dusty had other ideas. Caleb first noticed the old Mustang before sunrise, standing alone near the far western edge of the orchard where the land sloped gently downward into brittle grass and wild brush. The horse was pawing at the same patch of earth again, his scarred hoofs striking dry soil with a determination that felt almost unnatural. Caleb frowned and approached, brushing sleep from his eyes. "What is it, old man?" he muttered, expecting nothing. Dusty stopped only briefly, his dark eyes locking onto Caleb before returning to the ground with renewed urgency. Dirt scattered across dead weeds. Beneath the topsoil, Caleb noticed something strange. The earth here was darker. Softer. Different from the surrounding drought-stricken land. He crouched, running rough fingers through the disturbed soil, but before he could investigate further, the low hum of engine shattered the morning calm. 3 black SUVs rolled down the gravel drive, their polished exteriors absurd against the faded decay of Blackthorn Orchard. From the lead vehicle stepped Victor Langford, a sharply dressed vineyard magnate whose neighboring estate stretched across thousands of prosperous acres. His expensive boots barely touched the dust as he offered Caleb a thin, practiced smile. "Mr. Turner," Victor said smoothly, adjusting his tailored jacket. "I understand you are newly inherited and perhaps overwhelmed." Caleb straightened slowly, already disliking the man's tone. Victor gestured toward the orchard as though discussing an unfortunate eyesore. "This land has been dead for decades. But I am willing to offer you $500,000 today. Cash. Enough to solve your debts and start over." $500,000. To a bankrupt rancher, it should have sounded like salvation. But Caleb's gaze drifted toward Dusty, who had moved between him and Victor's vehicles, ears pinned, body tense. The old horse rarely showed aggression, yet now he stood firm, almost protective. Victor's smile tightened. "You would be wise to accept before maintenance costs bury you." Caleb hesitated. Every logical part of him screamed to sign. But there was something too eager in Victor's offer, something polished yet predatory. Why would a wealthy investor pay so much for worthless dead land? "I need time," Caleb replied. Victor's expression cooled instantly, though his voice remained syrup-smooth. "Of course. But opportunities do not wait forever." As the convoy disappeared down the gravel road, silence returned, broken only by Dusty's heavy breathing. Caleb turned back toward the patch of disturbed earth. The old horse resumed digging almost immediately, more forcefully than before. Then, with a sharp metallic clink, Dusty's hoof struck something beneath the soil. Caleb froze. Beneath layers of dust and forgotten years, something hidden was waiting. And for the first time, Caleb began to suspect that Blackthorn Orchard had never been worthless at all. Caleb knelt in the dry soil as golden afternoon light spilled across Blackthorn Orchard, his calloused fingers brushing away decades of dust from the metal object Dusty had uncovered. The old Mustang stood close beside him, nostrils flaring softly, his weathered body still carrying that strange, unwavering urgency. Beneath the earth lay the rusted edge of an iron lockbox, its surface scarred by time but unmistakably deliberate. Caleb's pulse quickened. With an old shovel from the barn and more determination than he had felt in years, he carefully dug around the box until its full shape emerged from the hardened ground. It was small, perhaps 2 feet long, reinforced with iron bands and sealed tight despite years underground. Whoever buried it had intended for it to stay hidden. Caleb hauled it free, grunting under its surprising weight, and carried it to the farmhouse porch while Dusty followed close behind, each hoofbeat steady against the brittle earth. Using a hammer and rusted pry bar, Caleb finally forced the corroded latch open. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were documents. Not money. Not gold. Paper. At first, disappointment flickered through him, but that feeling vanished as he unfolded the first yellowed page. They were land surveys. Geological reports. Mineral rights contracts bearing his Uncle Walter's name. Caleb's brow furrowed as he scanned. Technical terms he barely understood, but one phrase repeated often enough to stand out like thunder in silence: lithium reserve deposits. His breath caught. Additional maps showed deep underground mineral concentrations stretching beneath much of Blackthorn Orchard, with valuation estimates from nearly 30 years earlier projecting extraordinary worth should extraction rights ever be secured. Caleb sat back heavily in his chair, dust swirling around his boots, trying to process what he held. The dead orchard was not worthless. It was sitting atop one of the largest undeveloped lithium deposits in Northern California. In modern markets, such reserves could be worth billions. His uncle had known. More importantly, he had hidden it. As evening settled, Caleb searched deeper through the box and found a leather-bound journal belonging to Walter Turner. The old rancher's entries revealed decades of pressure from corporations, vineyard tycoons, and land developers who had sought to force him off the property after independent surveys revealed the deposit's existence. Walter had refused every offer, believing that once industrial greed touched the land, its soul would be destroyed. Instead, he preserved the orchard, waiting for someone trustworthy to inherit both the burden and the truth. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he closed the journal. For years, he had believed life had only stripped things away from him. But now, beneath his failures, grief, and debt, fate had placed something extraordinary directly in his path. Still, the revelation brought danger as surely as hope. Victor Langford's suspiciously generous offer suddenly made terrifying sense. He knew. Or at least suspected. Caleb glanced toward Dusty, who stood quietly near the porch steps, his silvered mane stirring in the cool evening breeze. The horse lowered his head slightly, almost as though the burden of this secret had belonged to him all along. Caleb stepped down from the porch and rested his forehead gently against Dusty's scarred neck. "You knew where to look," he whispered. The old mustang exhaled softly, warm breath rising into the fading air. As darkness settled over Blackthorn Orchard, Caleb understood one thing with painful clarity: he had not inherited ruin. He had inherited a war. And thanks to an old horse no one else valued, he finally held the first weapon strong enough to fight back. The following morning, a storm of tension hung heavier than the coastal fog drifting through Blackthorn Orchard. Caleb Turner sat at his uncle's scarred wooden kitchen table, Walter's journal spread open beside geological maps and mineral surveys worth more than anything he had ever touched. Sunlight filtered weakly through cracked windows, tracing pale gold across faded pages that could either save his life or place a target squarely on his back. Outside, Dusty paced restlessly near the barn, his ears flicking toward the long gravel drive as though sensing danger before it arrived. Caleb had barely finished securing the documents inside a hidden floor compartment beneath the farmhouse when the sound of engines shattered the fragile quiet once again. Victor Langford returned, this time with lawyers. Their luxury vehicles rolled in like polished predators against the dead orchard's brittle stillness. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his hat pulled low, shoulders squared with a steadiness he did not entirely feel. Victor emerged wearing the same immaculate smile, but today there was steel beneath it. "Mr. Turner," he said smoothly, holding out a revised contract. "I am prepared to increase my offer to $2 million. Caleb's jaw tightened, though he kept his face unreadable. $2 million was no longer temptation. It was confirmation. Victor's eyes drifted briefly across the land, not with pity, but hunger. "You are a practical man," Victor continued. "This orchard is dying. Restoration is impossible. Let me relieve you of an impossible burden." Caleb glanced beyond him at the dead rose, now seeing not ruin but strategy. His uncle had protected this land for decades, disguising extraordinary wealth beneath decay. Selling now would not only betray Walter's sacrifice, but surrender everything to men who saw land only in profit margins. "It is not for sale," Caleb said quietly. Victor's polished expression faltered for the first time. "The vineyard." Mogul stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You may not fully understand what you have inherited." Caleb met his gaze evenly. "I think I understand enough." For one long, brittle moment, silence stretched between them like dry wire before Victor's smile returned, colder now. "Very well. But pressure has a way of changing minds." As the convoy departed, Dusty suddenly let out a sharp warning snort and stamped hard near the orchard's western fence line. Caleb followed immediately, instincts sharpened by both fear and trust. There, partially concealed beneath overgrown brush, he discovered survey markers freshly placed into the soil. Someone had entered the property overnight. Caleb's blood ran cold. Victor was not waiting for negotiation. He was preparing for acquisition by force of legal manipulation, environmental claims, or worse. Walter's journal had warned of this exact tactic: falsified land disputes, forged easements, predatory lawsuits. Caleb realized then that owning Blackthorn Orchard meant more than inheritance. It meant defending it against an empire built on greed. That afternoon, Caleb drove into Sonoma and sought out Eleanor Whitaker, an aging environmental attorney and old friend of Walter's whose sharp mind had once helped shield the orchard from corporate seizure. Eleanor, silver-haired and stern-eyed, reviewed the documents in silence before finally looking up. "Your uncle was sitting on one of the most valuable lithium reserves in the country," she said. "And if Langford gets control, this valley becomes an industrial extraction zone." Caleb stared out her office window toward distant rolling hills, understanding the true stakes for the first time. This was no longer just about survival. It was about preservation. About legacy. About protecting something larger than himself. As he returned to the orchard that evening, Dusty waited by the gate, silhouetted beneath a crimson sunset that bled across the dying trees. Caleb rested his hand on the old Mustang's neck, drawing strength from the quiet creature who had already changed everything. The battle for Blackthorn Orchard had begun, and for the first time in years, Caleb was no longer running from ruin. He was standing his ground. For the next several weeks, Caleb Turner lived with the weight of buried fortune and approaching danger pressing against every sunrise over Blackthorn Orchard. Each morning arrived wrapped in coastal mist, drifting through dead apple trees like ghosts guarding secrets too valuable for the modern world. Caleb worked tirelessly to restore portions of the ruined property, repairing fences, clearing irrigation channels, and breathing small signs of life back into land everyone else had dismissed as dead. Yet beneath every practical task was a deeper mission, securing legal control over the lithium reserve before Victor Langford found a way to seize it. Eleanor Whitaker moved swiftly, filing mineral rights protections, inheritance reinforcements, and environmental preservation clauses that would make hostile corporate acquisition far more difficult. Still, Victor's influence stretched deep through Sonoma County. Caleb began noticing unfamiliar trucks parked along neighboring roads, private survey drones circling distant tree lines, and county inspectors suddenly questioning obscure property code violations that had gone ignored for decades. The pressure was building exactly as Walter had predicted. But while lawyers fought on paper, Dusty continued his silent vigilance. The old Mustang's instinct seemed almost supernatural. One cold morning, Caleb found Dusty once again pouring furiously near the orchard's northern ridge, a section Walter's maps had only vaguely referenced. Curious, Caleb followed with shovel in hand. Beneath tangled roots and hardened earth, he uncovered another hidden cache, this one larger and far more revealing. Inside were original federal mineral registration certificates, private correspondence with energy companies, and most importantly, a sealed letter addressed directly to Caleb. His breath caught as he unfolded his late uncle's shaky handwriting. Walter explained that Blackthorn Orchard's lithium deposit had grown exponentially more valuable over recent decades as global demand for electric batteries surged. Preliminary estimates from updated private surveys suggested the reserve's value could exceed $40 billion if responsibly developed. Caleb sat back against the cold earth, overwhelmed by the magnitude. He had not inherited mere wealth. He had inherited one of the most strategically valuable private landholdings in America. But Walter's letter carried a warning stronger than any promise of fortune. If greed claims this land, Walter had written, they will strip it bare until nothing remains but poisoned earth. Protect it, even from yourself. Those words settled deep in Caleb's soul. For a man who had spent years desperate simply to survive, the temptation to sell and escape hardship forever was powerful. $40 billion could erase every debt, every scar, every lonely mile behind him. Yet as he looked across the orchard, where Dusty stood beneath brittle branches with sunlight touching his silvered coat, Caleb understood that wealth without wisdom could become another form of ruin. He began developing a new vision, not extraction for corporate empire, but stewardship. Sustainable partnerships. Conservation-first development. Sanctuary land for rescued horses funded by responsible resource management. Walter had not left him a lottery ticket. He had left him a moral test. News of Caleb's strengthened legal standing soon reached Victor Langford, whose patience finally cracked. Public smear campaigns began circulating, painting Caleb as an unstable bankrupt outsider obstructing regional economic progress. Investors arrived with increasingly aggressive offers, some exceeding $50 million upfront. Yet each time temptation whispered, Caleb remembered the dead orchard, the hidden journals, and the old horse who had led him here not for greed, but truth. One evening, as storm clouds rolled low over Sonoma's hills, Caleb stood at the ridge with Dusty beside him, reading Walter's letter once more beneath gathering thunder. Lightning flickered over the distant valley where vineyards gleamed like kingdoms built on polished wealth. But here, on scarred land once dismissed as worthless, something greater was rising. Caleb had spent much of his life believing broken things were meant to be abandoned. Now he understood that sometimes, the most shattered inheritance carries the power to heal not only one man's fate, but generations to come. Autumn settled over Blackthorn Orchard with a fierce beauty Caleb Turner had never expected to witness on land so long abandoned. Golden leaves drifted through brittle rows, and for brief moments, the ruined orchard almost seemed to remember what it had once been. But beneath that fragile beauty, pressure was mounting like a storm gathering behind clear skies. Victor Langford had stopped pretending this was a business negotiation. His campaign had evolved into calculated siege. County zoning boards suddenly issued notices challenging Caleb's land usage permits. Environmental inspectors, suspiciously aligned with Langford's corporate allies, arrived weekly searching for violations severe enough to stall mineral rights protections. Anonymous legal claims surfaced, questioning obscure portions of Walter Turner's inheritance legitimacy. Each attack was polished, technical, and relentless. Caleb found himself fighting not with fists, but paperwork, hearings, and endless legal strategy sessions with Eleanor Whitaker. For a man raised by hard labor and open land, battling billion-dollar greed through courthouse filings felt like wrestling smoke. Yet he refused to fold. One evening, after a brutal county hearing designed to delay his conservation trust, Caleb returned exhausted beneath darkening skies. Rain clouds hung low over the orchard, their shadows stretching across dead trees like old wounds. Dusty greeted him at the barn, but something was wrong. The old Mustang's body was tense, his breathing sharp, ears pinned toward the western ridge. Caleb's instinct stirred immediately. Dusty had warned him before. Grabbing a lantern, Caleb followed as the horse moved with surprising urgency through wind-bent grass toward the northern reserve. There, hidden near a dry creek bed, Caleb discovered unauthorized drilling equipment and fresh survey stakes placed illegally under cover of darkness. Langford's contractors had crossed onto protected land, likely seeking independent confirmation of the reserve's richest concentration zones before final court rulings could block them permanently. Caleb's pulse thundered. This was not merely pressure anymore. It was theft in progress. As rain began to fall, Dusty suddenly blocked Caleb's path with powerful force, refusing to let him descend a muddy slope toward unstable excavation trenches. Seconds later, saturated soil gave way where Caleb would have stepped, collapsing into a dangerous sink of loosened earth and machinery debris below. Caleb staggered back, breathless, staring at the destruction narrowly avoided. Dusty had saved him. Again. The old horse stood firm in the storm, rain slicking his scarred coat as thunder rolled across the valley. In that moment, Caleb understood something deeper than gratitude. Dusty was no longer simply a guide to buried fortune. He was guardian of legacy itself. The illegal operation was immediately documented by Eleanor's legal team, and photographic evidence of trespassing, unauthorized drilling, and environmental violations triggered state-level investigations into Langford's corporate empire. For the first time, Victor's carefully polished image began to fracture publicly. Investors grew uneasy. Regulatory agencies intensified scrutiny. The same greed that had hunted Blackthorn Orchard was now exposing itself under legal daylight. But victory came at a cost. Caleb knew Langford would not retreat quietly. Men who built empires on acquisition rarely surrendered when cornered. Still, standing beneath the storm beside the horse everyone else had once dismissed as old and worthless, Caleb felt something stronger than fear. He felt purpose. Blackthorn Orchard was no longer a bankrupt man's final gamble. It had become a battlefield between exploitation and stewardship, greed and grace. And while Victor wielded wealth, influence, and power, Caleb possessed something rarer: truth, resilience, and the unwavering loyalty of a Mustang whose instincts had already proven more valuable than billions buried underground. As lightning split the sky above the dead orchard, Caleb rested his hand on Dusty's rain-soaked neck and made a silent vow. No matter how powerful the enemy became, this land would not be surrendered. Not to fear. Not to greed. Not while either of them still stood. Winter arrived in Sonoma County beneath iron-gray skies, and with it came the legal reckoning Victor Langford had spent decades believing he could always avoid. State investigators, armed with evidence gathered from unauthorized drilling, falsified zoning influence, and environmental trespass, launched formal proceedings that shook Langford's empire harder than any market collapse. News outlets that had once praised him as a visionary vineyard magnate now dissected his corporate overreach with ruthless precision. Headlines shifted. Investors retreated. Political allies distanced themselves. For the first time in his life, Victor Langford was no longer the predator shaping the valley's future. He was a man defending himself from the consequences of his own greed. Caleb Turner, meanwhile, stood in stark contrast to the storm consuming his enemy. Though still financially strained, he had become something unexpected: a symbol. Local farmers, conservationists, and independent landowners began rallying around Blackthorn Orchard, inspired by the bankrupt rancher who had refused to surrender priceless land to exploitation. Walter Turner's journals, once hidden beneath dry soil, became powerful testimony in state hearings, exposing decades of coercion aimed at stealing one of California's most valuable private reserves. Eleanor Whitaker's legal brilliance transformed Caleb's defense into a broader preservation movement, securing federal conservation partnerships that protected both the lithium reserve and the surrounding ecosystem from reckless industrial destruction. But the greatest turning point came not in a courtroom, but on a cold December morning when Caleb unveiled the Blackthorn Stewardship Initiative. Rather than selling extraction rights outright, Caleb announced a revolutionary plan: sustainable, environmentally responsible mineral development paired with permanent land conservation, local job creation, and the establishment of a sanctuary for abused and abandoned horses funded directly by the reserve's future profits. The announcement stunned the nation. Financial analysts called it unprecedented. Rural communities called it hope. Caleb called it honoring Walter's final wish. Standing before cameras in his weathered ranch coat, with Dusty calm beside him beneath the skeletal orchard trees, Caleb spoke with quiet conviction. "This land is not a prize to strip bare," he said. "It is a responsibility. Wealth means nothing if it destroys the very ground that gave it." His words traveled far beyond Sonoma. In a world increasingly shaped by extraction and excess, a broke rancher and an old Mustang had become unlikely guardians of ethical fortune. Public support surged. Regulatory approval accelerated. Sustainable development partnerships formed under Caleb's strict stewardship terms, ensuring Blackthorn Orchard would generate extraordinary wealth without sacrificing its soul. By year's end, Caleb Turner was no longer a bankrupt outsider. He was majority steward of one of America's most valuable protected mineral estates, with personal holdings worth billions. Yet despite unimaginable financial transformation, those closest to him noticed what mattered most had not changed. He still repaired fences by hand. Still wore worn boots dusted by orchard soil. Still began each morning beside Dusty, whose silver muzzle had become as iconic to Blackthorn as the land itself. Victor Langford, once untouchable, was ultimately forced to resign from multiple corporate boards amid mounting investigations and public disgrace. His vineyard survived, but his ambitions to control Blackthorn Orchard died beneath the weight of exposed corruption. And so, in the quiet valley where greed had once circled like vultures over dead land, justice arrived not through power alone, but through endurance, truth, and the loyalty of a horse no one else understood. As snow dusted the orchard's barren branches and new life quietly prepared beneath frozen earth, Caleb stood at Walter's grave with Dusty beside him, understanding at last that inheritance was never truly about wealth. It was about what kind of man one chooses to become when fortune finally finds him. Spring returned to Blackthorn Orchard like a long-promised redemption, unfurling green life across land once written off as dead. Where skeletal branches had stood for decades, Careful restoration efforts now coaxed blossoms from surviving apple trees, their pale pink petals drifting on warm California winds like quiet proof that broken things could bloom again. Beneath Caleb Turner's stewardship, the orchard transformed not into an industrial wasteland, but into something far rarer, a living symbol of balance between prosperity and preservation. Sustainable lithium partnerships, negotiated under Caleb's uncompromising ethical terms, generated extraordinary revenue while advanced extraction technologies protected groundwater, ecosystems, and surrounding farmland. The world had expected another billionaire to emerge. Instead, it witnessed the rise of a rancher determined to prove that wealth and wisdom did not have to destroy one another. The Blackthorn Equine Sanctuary soon became the heart of that vision. Spread across hundreds of protected acres, the sanctuary welcomed abused, abandoned, and neglected horses from across the country, many arriving scarred, starving, or deemed beyond saving. Caleb understood those creatures better than most. He had once been broken too. With Dusty as its living emblem, the sanctuary grew into one of America's most respected rehabilitation centers, blending veterinary excellence with open pasture healing beneath Sonoma's golden hills. Families visited from across the nation. Children learned to ride rescued mustangs once destined for slaughter or abandonment. Veterans found therapy through equine trust programs. And every success traced back to an old horse whose instincts had unearthed not only fortune, but purpose. Dusty himself became something larger than legend. Though age had silvered his coat and slowed his stride, he remained Caleb's constant companion, often seen leading newly rescued horses gently through Blackthorn's rolling fields with a patience that seemed almost human. Visitors would stand quietly at fence lines, watching the once-forgotten Mustang move with weathered grace, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing more than an animal. They were witnessing the soul of the orchard itself. Caleb never allowed success to erase humility. Though his personal fortune now placed him among the wealthiest landowners in America, he continued living in the restored farmhouse Walter had left behind, choosing weathered wood and honest soil over mansions or excess. He reinvested heavily into local communities, helping struggling ranchers preserve family lands, funding agricultural sustainability programs, and creating scholarships for rural youth who understood both hardship and hope. Blackthorn Orchard became a model studied worldwide, proving that stewardship could rival greed not only morally, but economically. Financial magazines called Caleb visionary. Conservationists called him revolutionary. But in the quiet moments before sunrise, as he walked orchard rows beside Dusty with dew silvering the grass, Caleb thought of himself more simply, a man who had been given one last chance and chosen not to waste it. Years after arriving bankrupt and broken, Caleb often paused at the western ridge where Dusty had first begun digging. The hidden earth beneath his boots still held unimaginable wealth, but the true treasure standing beside him was flesh, breath, and loyalty. Dusty had not simply saved Blackthorn Orchard. He had saved Caleb from becoming the kind of man fortune often corrupts. As spring sunlight poured over blooming trees and rescued horses thundered freely across land once destined for exploitation, Blackthorn no longer resembled ruin. It had become sanctuary, legacy, and living miracle. And sometimes, Caleb would rest his hand on Dusty's aging neck, watching new life stretch across the valley, and quietly marvel that the greatest fortunes are not always buried underground. Sometimes, they arrive on four weary legs, carrying truth through dust. Years softened Blackthorn Orchard into something that felt less like reclaimed land and more like sacred ground. The once ruined property had become a flourishing expanse of blooming orchards, protected hills, and rolling sanctuary pastures where rescued horses ran beneath wide California skies. Visitors came from around the world to witness what ethical stewardship could achieve, but for Caleb Turner, the true heartbeat of Blackthorn had never been the billions beneath the soil or the empire of healing built above it. It had always been Dusty. The old Mustang had grown slower with each passing season. His powerful stride had become measured. The silver in his coat had brightened until he seemed almost carved from moonlight itself. Yet even in old age, Dusty remained a quiet force, his wise dark eyes carrying the same steady knowing they had held the day Caleb first arrived broken and bankrupt on forgotten land. Every morning, without fail, Caleb still walked the orchard rows beside him. Their journeys were slower now, often no more than a gentle mile beneath apple blossoms or golden autumn leaves, but those quiet rides had become something deeper than routine. They were sacred rituals of gratitude. On one crisp fall evening, with the setting sun spilling copper light across the western ridge, Dusty led Caleb one final time to the very patch of earth where decades earlier he had first begun digging. The old horse's breathing was calm, though thinner now, his movements deliberate beneath the fading light. Caleb dismounted slowly, his weathered hands resting on Dusty's neck as wind stirred through the orchard's flourishing branches. Around them, the sanctuary stretched wide and alive, filled with the sounds of healing Walter Turner had only dreamed possible. Children laughed in distant paddocks. Rescued horses thundered freely across preserved fields. The land was no longer surviving. It was thriving. Dusty lowered himself gently beneath the old oak tree overlooking Blackthorn's vast miracle. Caleb knelt beside him, his throat tightening with the kind of sorrow reserved only for those rare souls who have saved us more than once. There were no grand speeches. No desperate prayers. Just quiet understanding between a man and the horse who had carried him not merely to fortune, but to redemption. Caleb rested his forehead against Dusty's silvered brow as twilight painted the valley gold. "You gave me everything," he whispered. Dusty's breath left softly, warm against Caleb's hand, before stillness settled like peace itself. Beneath the same oak where hidden truth had first risen from dust, the old mustang passed not as something broken, abandoned, or forgotten, but as legend. In the years that followed, Caleb erected no towering monument. Dusty's resting place remained simple, a weathered wooden marker beneath the oak, engraved with words Caleb believed carried more truth than wealth ever could. He led me to the land. Then he led me to myself. Visitors still paused there in reverent silence, often leaving apples, wildflowers, or old horseshoes in tribute. And though Blackthorn's fortune continued shaping communities, preserving land, and healing wounded lives, Caleb knew its greatest gift had never been measured in dollars. It was measured in loyalty. In mercy. In the miracle that sometimes, the weakest seeming soul carries the power to restore everything greed, grief, and time tried to destroy. As Caleb grew old beneath the orchard Dusty had saved, he often watched sunset spill across blooming trees and sanctuary fields, understanding at last that true inheritance was never about what a man owns. It is about what he protects, what he heals, and what he chooses to become. And somewhere in the rustle of apple branches beneath California wind, Caleb could still almost hear familiar hoofbeats in the dust, reminding him that sometimes, the oldest horse carries the deepest miracle.